Hi, I'm Dr. Amy Turner and welcome to Protein Text Podcast, the platform where we talk to life science leaders and get to grips with the big questions of the day that help us to understand the book of life. Our guest today is Professor Richard Lea, an internationally recognised life science leader in the field of reproductive biology. For the past 25 years, his research has focused on the effects of environmental contaminants on human and animal reproductive health. Beyond his research, he is an outstanding advocate for public outreach and scientific communication. He's been involved in previous podcasts with Test Him, has had a Channel 4 documentary, and is soon to be the face of Netflix, raising awareness of how our environment can have a monumental impact on our fertility and reproductive health. In this episode, we'll explore the human sperm quality debate with a focus on the environmental pollutome and highlight the importance of public engagement in translating fundamental science into real-world impact. So Richard, thank you so much for joining me on today's podcast.
Thank you for inviting me, Amy. It's a pleasure to be here.
Amazing. So reproductive health is literally the lifeblood of the human race, right? But for the past 25 years, your work has shed light on how sort of as a society, a growing human society, we're actually affecting our reproductive health. Can you summarise for us what your career trajectory has looked like and what are the key kind of findings that your research has shown, starting from way back in your PhD days, which was in Sheffield Hallam?
It was. Right. So I've had a number of different projects, or I've been involved in a number of different projects, I should say. My PhD, interestingly, was looking at the horse and pregnancy in the horse and how the placenta attaches during those early stages of gestation. And that species is very, very different. That's probably a topic for another podcast. But those early days sort of set me up to think about the effects of the uterine environment on early development. So having completed my PhD at Sheffield Hallam, I became interested in what determines pregnancy success and what happens when things go wrong and pregnancy fails. And so I was lucky enough to get a postdoctoral placement over at McMaster University, which is in Ontario, Canada, not too far from Toronto, a place called Hamilton. And the 3 years I was based over in Ontario, I focused on the very difficult problem of recurrent pregnancy loss, recurrent miscarriage. And we looked at the mechanisms that may underlie pregnancy loss. We did a little bit of work with mice that have a high pregnancy failure rate as a model, if you like, for the human. And we looked at various growth factors and cytokines, factors produced within the uterine environment that play a role in pregnancy success. And there was a lot of immunology involved in these particular studies. Because if you think about it, any mammalian pregnancy is half the father, half the mother, paternal complement of chromosomes. Yeah. So you could think about any pregnancy as a type of graft, really. So theoretically, all pregnant mothers should respond immunologically against their own pregnancies. Wow. And you think, oh, that must be bad. Well, sometimes it is bad, but actually in a majority of situations, that immune response is good, and we have a protective effect in utero.
Okay.
So that was one of my very, very early interests in trying to understand how that protective effect works and what happens when things go wrong. And we identified a few factors and things involved. Following that, as I said, there's a number of placements here. I moved back from Canada and I went straight to the University of Edinburgh, where I was looking at the interaction of hormones with reproductive tissues, if you like, in both pregnant women and non-pregnant women. So I worked with clinically trained doctors in Edinburgh, and we looked at the role of progesterone in particular and how it primes the uterus and what it switches on and off, and also what happens when things don't quite work. And there was a little bit of work on counteracting the effects of progesterone and what happens there. So we looked at a treatment called RU486 or mifepristone, which is used in a obstetric context, shall we say. But all these studies were human-based, and I carried on my interests on recurrent miscarriage at the time. So again, this reinforced my interests in the field. Generated a number of papers from that period in Edinburgh, and I had the opportunity of speaking at one point to an association called the Recurrent Miscarriage Association. And so I agreed to do this. I thought this would be quite interesting, and I went along to present the female perspective, relating my findings and what I thought was happening when pregnancy recurrently fails in the human. And one of my colleagues went along to present the male perspective, and this was back in the 1990s. And interestingly, we turned up, and I remember looking out across the audience, and I would say that more than 90% of the audience were female, which is quite interesting. And it highlighted a few things to me. One, it's the problem recurrent miscarriage is quite often described as a female problem. And therefore, I guess there was a sort of underlying attitude. It's a society thing at the time that it's not a problem that men need to worry about. However, I gave this presentation and had very, very useful feedback. And I was aware that my talk had quite an impact, including an emotional impact on the audience.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Because it turned out that many in the audience were patients, were women who had suffered 2, 3 or more consecutive miscarriages. And I would say that experience made me aware of the potential impact of my research on the population, and that it's not just about being in the laboratory and doing experiments and working with biopsy samples. It's about relating that to a real problem that causes distress. And in those days, recurrent miscarriage was the condition I was most interested in. Following my years in Edinburgh, I then moved up to Aberdeen, went even further north in the UK, and I worked within an institute called the Rowett Research Institute, which is affiliated to the University of Aberdeen. And this was it's quite a famous institute, and it's an institute that's focused on the importance and effects of nutrition.
Right.
On health and well-being. And I came in and I looked at the nutritional effects specifically on reproduction, given my previous background. Spent quite a number of years at the Institute exploring effects of undernutrition, for example, and overnutrition. Interestingly, working on various species as model systems to the human. I was in fact involved in a number of projects in those days, but one I can mention very briefly is we were interested in adolescent pregnancy in humans.
Right.
And we found that the degree of nutrition given to young sheep that were carrying a single lamb impacted on the growth of the lamb post gestation. That's a very short version of all this work, but again, it reinforced the importance of the environment in which the fetus develops, which the lamb develops, which the human baby develops. So nutrition is an environmental factor already. And hence my awareness of the impact of the environment was elevated through these very, very interesting studies that I was involved in. And it was then I became aware of the very worrying situation of the polluted world in which we live. And working with one of my colleagues in Aberdeen, we had an opportunity to apply for some research funds to explore the effects of environmental contaminants on early development. And we were successful in getting some funds to investigate that particular problem. And that really was the start of my research program on environmental impacts on reproduction. Following 10 or 11 years in Aberdeen, I moved to the University of Nottingham, where I'm currently based. So this was in 2006, and I was very lucky in being offered a post to be part of a brand new school of veterinary medicine. And it was the first new vet school in the UK for over 50 years at the time.
Wow.
So it was very exciting, and the curriculum was being reviewed and redeveloped because it hadn't changed for many years. And so I became part of a very fortunate group to develop this teaching curriculum, but also to continue with my research and establish my research interests within this brand new vet school. And hence, I took forward the environmental contaminants type work.
Yeah.
And I took it forward in two ways. One was looking at the problem of declining male fertility.
Was this the first time that you looked at the male lens?
Yes, it's the first time I looked at the male lens. That's absolutely right. The background to that is that men around the world are reported to have reduced sperm counts. And so there's a decline in sperm counts, which is a measure of sperm quality. And there's been lots and lots of studies published on this particular area. And I think that the evidence overall is quite compelling. But it's not just declining sperm counts. There's also an increased incidence of testicular cancer in men, and there's an increased incidence of malformations at birth as well. And those malformations, this is human I'm talking about here. So the problem of the testes not descending into the scrotum. It's called cryptorchidism, which means hidden testis.
Right.
So there's a delay in the descent of the testes, and there's also a malformation in the penis, where the urethra opens at the base of the penis instead of at the tip. It's called hyperspadias. So the incidence of these malformations, testicular cancer in younger men, and decline in sperm counts are all happening together in the same parts of the world. And so the school of thought when I joined Nottingham was that actually perhaps they're all linked, and perhaps they're all linked to the changing environment in which we live. All of that interested me, and the evidence for the cancer and the malformations was very strong. But the evidence in support of decline in sperm counts had generated a huge amount of debate, and continues to do so actually to the present day.
Yeah.
And I wanted to explore that in a little bit more detail.
Did you tell me previously that men these days have half the sperm count than their dads did, 50 years ago, their grandparents
their
did?
grandfathers, yeah. It's really declined to that degree. So from 100 million per mil down to half of that number.
In 50 years?
Over 50 years or so.
Wow.
So it's 50, if you look at all of the papers on decline in sperm counts in men, we're talking about a period that spans the best part of 70 years now.
Which is relatively short when you think about it.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And because it's so short, it's thought that it's likely to be environmental rather than a genetic problem, because it's too quick for those type of genetic changes to occur. So I then managed to get access, fortunately, to a database of sperm quality measurements taken from dogs.
Okay.
So this was very unique,
Yeah.
and then a really interesting turn of events in terms of my career development. Mm-hmm. So this data, it came from an organisation not too far from where I'm based in Nottingham. It's an organisation that breeds dogs to support people who are partially sighted or blind people.
Right.
And these are dogs that live in normal houses.
Yeah.
They're not experimental dogs. Just let me be absolutely clear on that.
Yeah.
They're just normal dogs, and they're trained. And because they're bred, you need the stud dogs, and the stud dogs live in normal homes, normal families. But they're brought in regularly to to this facility. And they're given a sort of reproductive MOT, if you like. No harm is done to the dog, just check they're in good health. And that reproductive MOT includes collecting a sperm sample.
Yeah.
And this has been going on for decades and decades. And I was fortunate enough to get access to all of this data. And so I had a look. And amazingly, we found that the quality of sperm produced by these dogs over a period of 26 years had declined, and it had declined in parallel with the decline in human sperm quality. And I thought, well, is there a connection between the two? And so the current sort of working hypothesis, if you like, that I'm working to is that we're a nation of dog lovers. You know, I grew up with dogs in the house, used to have border collies, a great breed.
Yeah.
And therefore, dogs, they live in the same environment as we do. They're exposed to the same contaminants in the environment. So sitting here right now, Amy, chatting to you, I can see that we've got carpet on the floor, we're in these comfy chairs, so there'd be flame retardants. So all these factors that we're exposed to every day as humans, the dogs would be as well.
So what are the contaminants? Obviously, you mentioned flame retardants. What's in the carpet? Flame retardants as well?
Flame retardants, yeah. It could
cleaning
be pesticides. Cleaning products.
Kind of thing. Beauty products, maybe.
Yeah, cosmetics, absolutely. All these things, detergents that we use. There are contaminants that are very long-lived in the environment, even contaminants that have been banned. An industrial source of contaminants, so PCBs, for example, polychlorinated biphenyls. So they were used in electrical apparatus and insulating cables, that type of thing, but they persist. So wherever you look, you can find plastics. Of course, is the one that we all relate to. Plasticizers. We live in a world of plastics, and these phthalates are everywhere. The reality is we're all exposed to a cocktail of these chemicals. Yeah. And so are the dogs that are our pets. So my theory is what we see in the human, we also see in our pet dogs, and the data that I've generated suggests that is the case. And interestingly, we've recently further expanded that study from 26 years to 35 years and shown that decrease in sperm quality in the dogs is continuing.
So you mentioned sperm count. What other metrics do you also look for to determine sperm quality?
A majority of the data in the human is about sperm counts. Interestingly, in the dog, it was sperm motility that declined rather than sperm count. But looking at the way sperm swim is a key index of how effective that sperm will be. Yeah. So sperm count, sperm motility, and also morphology as well, looking at how many sperm have a normal appearance, a normal morphology. Yeah. There are other tests as well. So you could look at the fragmentation of DNA in the sperm head, for example. But the standard ones are those three: count, motility, and morphology. Yeah. So motility declined about 30%. It was over the 26-year period from the first study that we did, and that was a paper published back in 2016. So that was quite concerning.
Yeah, definitely concerning. So obviously you were talking now, when I think about sperm count and sperm quality, the first thing I think of is, well, if you've got a low sperm quality, that's going to affect the ability for you to conceive. But obviously there's people are still conceiving, maybe slightly more struggles, but is there anything else that sperm quality can also impact, and not just conception? Is it, gestation periods, miscarriage, for example? What are the other impacts?
Yes, absolutely. One thing I should say before I answer that question, I'm sounding like a politician now, but before I answer that question, is that with the dog study, these stud dogs, they are still really, really healthy dogs. Mm-hmm. And they're still used as stud dogs, but we're worried that decline is going to continue. And of course, on the human side, there's a worry that the decline in sperm count is going to continue as well. But to answer your question, if you have sperm which is of low quality, but the sperm is still able to fertilize an egg and generate a pregnancy, then there is a reported linkage with the ability of that embryo to implant and then form a healthy embryo, fetus, baby at the end of gestation. Yeah. So older men, for example, it's fairly well established now, I think, that older men, that the quality of the sperm is likely to be lower than in younger men, but it might not be visible. It could be an effect on the DNA in the sperm, but the sperm itself is still able to generate that pregnancy. Right. So the answer to your question is yes, there is a linkage there for sure, and there are many research groups exploring that at the moment. So it's not just the female side. It's the male side as well. Amazing.
So for the last 25 years, it seems like you've had such an impactful research career. Obviously, the work that you do is incredibly translational to, society as a whole. Throughout your career, have you had any specific kind of mentors or moments that have kind of sparked your interest to change the projects or influence the projects that you've been working on?
Yes, absolutely. I've had my mentors along that journey. In Edinburgh, I worked with a clinician. That was Professor Hilary Critchley, and very much a mentor to me now. And she opened my eyes in terms of the interaction of the endocrine system, the hormone system, and the immune system, and how that can be of great benefit to understanding how pregnancy is established, the functionality of the human uterus, in terms of how menstruation occurs, for example, and what those immune cells do in the uterus.
Yeah. Does that go back to your sort of PhD days, looking at horse?
PhD plus, yes, it does. Yeah. I've never forgotten the PhD work, by the way, because the horse is a remarkable species.
I think I remember you telling me that a horse can gestate a zebra.
Yes,
is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, so the equids as a group, so the equids we're talking about, the horses, the donkeys, the zebras, the Przewalski's horse, the Mongolian wild horse, you would maybe call it. So they all have different numbers of chromosomes. And yet you can take a domestic horse and you can implant a zebra embryo, and she will carry that zebra all the way through gestation.
Wow.
It's not work I personally did, but one of my supervisors at the time, who was a world famous equine vet, Professor Twink Allen, his name was, did all those experiments. His contribution to that field is huge, by the way. But it's a fascinating observation, because the entire developing fetus is then foreign to the mother. Not just the paternal side, the maternal side as well.
So that brings about a lot of immunology questions then.
Absolutely it does, yes. Yeah.
Amazing. Just going back to that, you mentioned about the protective effect of the protective immunology that a woman would have on the growing fetus. Could you maybe describe what that is? Because I wouldn't have a clue what is actually happening biologically.
When we generate an immune response to anything, so we have an infection, we have an immune response, it can be the entire immune system. The uterus has a modified form of immunological defense. And so there are things that happen that are more local in terms of their interaction with antigens.
Okay.
is what we call one of the mucosal sites of the body, but the uterus is particularly specialized in this area. So if you were to look at the immune cells in the uterus, you'd recognize the cells. There are T cells. There are cells called natural killer cells, which we all have. But if you look at the what I would call the phenotype or the structure, things are a little bit different with those cells. So they respond, they're developed slightly differently, so that when they interact with an antigen, then that interaction could be protective. At least that's what we think.
Okay.
And the placenta has got modified antigens, modified transplantation antigens, which are a bit different. If you take a skin graft, take a couple, and you take a skin graft from the potential father and try and put it on the mother, she will reject that skin graft because it's not her, it's part of her, it's foreign material.
Yeah.
In the placenta, those antigens that the skin graft has are slightly modified in a way that is thought to stimulate a more of a protective immune response.
That's incredible.
Yeah, these are the modified, what we call HLA antigens, part of the major histocompatibility complex.
Yeah.
And the type of immune response that facilitates a pregnancy immunologically is more, I would say, immunosuppressive, particularly after the placenta has attached. Progesterone itself is a hugely immunosuppressive hormone.
Okay.
Which makes sense because it's protecting that developing embryo. It does lots of other things as well, of course. It keeps the uterus quiet so it doesn't contract, and it keeps the cervix closed and all those things. But it's also immunosuppressive.
Amazing.
So there's I guess in answer to your question, it's a huge field. It's a localized immunoresponse that is protective.
Yeah.
And once pregnancy is established, immunosuppression at the local level is very important.
Just talking to you now, the depth of research that you are interested in is vast, and it is so incredible to think about. It just opens your eyes really to everything that goes on within a pregnancy. It's a miracle really. But going back to sort of the sperm work that you're doing now, what are the practicalities of that? How are you in the lab? Obviously you mentioned the stud dogs, obviously testes as well. I think I've seen somewhere that you work on neutered testes from dogs as well. What sort of thing do you do in the lab to determine the effect of the environment? Let's go back to the environment and how that can affect that.
Yeah, so many male dogs will pay a visit to the local vet clinic. Yeah. And unfortunately, from the dog's perspective, they'll have their testicles removed. Mm-hmm. And it's nothing to do with my research. It's a behavioural thing. So many dogs are castrated or neutered, and those testes are disposed of, and the dog recovers and goes home. So many years ago, I thought, what an amazing resource of tissue this would be to do some work, to get a feeling for what's in those testes. Mm. And so I followed that up, and with consent, because obviously you need to get consent of the owners of the dogs and support of the local vet clinic. If they were willing, then rather than throw the testicles in the bin, they were given to me. And I did a number of things with those testicles, one of which was to see which chemical contaminants we could detect in them. Yeah. And in fact, we detected quite a range of contaminants. We detected these PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls I mentioned earlier. We detected diethyl hexyl phthalate, which is a chemical release from plastics. Phthalates give plastics their flexibility. Right. Those were the main ones we focused on. And what we did was we did a number of things. One of the things we did is we looked at the concentrations of these contaminants. Right. And we thought, what if we take some sperm from a dog and we wash it and we expose that sperm to those chemicals? What would they do to the sperm? Yeah. So we did just that. And we found with short-term incubation of the sperm with these contaminants, there was a decrease in motility, the ability of the sperm to swim, and an increase in DNA fragmentation.
Right.
So that's using the chemicals that are already present in those testes. We then extended that study, and we did a parallel study on human sperm, again with the appropriate consents, of course, and through my colleagues in the andrology unit in Nottingham. So we got approval to do this, and we saw exactly the same thing. So it's reinforcing that what we see in one species, we see in the other.
Yeah.
So that was interesting. We also looked at the profile of chemicals from these testes when the testes were collected from different parts of the UK and different parts of Europe. Mm-hmm. And to put it into context, on the human side, if you look back at the literature on male reproductive health and fertility, there are many studies comparing Denmark and Finland. So if you look at the two countries, Finland's a very rural country, beautiful country with lots of lakes. I'm sure Denmark's very beautiful as well. I've only been to Copenhagen, but it's more industrialized.
Yeah.
And hence the relative exposures of men living there is different. And in fact, the sperm quality in men from Finland was better than men in Denmark from a number of studies.
Right.
And so I thought it'd be interesting to look at dog testes from those two countries and managed to get these samples. And we demonstrated that the profiles of chemicals in those testes were different.
Right.
And we also looked at a number of pathologies. Working with one of my colleagues at the vet school, Rebecca Blanchard, did a wonderful study, really digging down into what constitutes a normal morphology of testis and when do we need to be concerned and where those differences are. And we showed that there were differences between the three countries. That's the UK, Finland and Denmark.
Wow.
Now, none of this shows cause and effect, but it adds to the story that where you are determines what chemical contaminants we are exposed to and what is happening locally in the testes that determine our fertility. So I think this string of papers that we published around that were quite important and quite pivotal in the field.
Definitely. And I think you've also mentioned as well that this isn't just humans and dogs. It goes to, the effective environmental contaminants can go in different food chains as well. So I think we've previously spoken about polar bears and killer whales. Perhaps you could talk about how that also translates.
It really is a polluted world. And we know that because those species that live in very remote areas of the world also have those contaminants within them. And one of those species is the polar bear.
Yeah.
And another one is the killer whale. Killer whales you find in various parts of the globe, of course. So how can that be? Well, there's two reasons why that can be. Yeah. One is many of the chemical contaminants are transported in the air on currents and can be transported long distances. And hence the spread in smoke, in fumes or whatever is quite extensive, probably more extensive than we initially realised. But another major factor is the food chain. Yeah. So if you think about these contaminants, if you have contaminants in the water, in the seas, in the lakes, then those contaminants are taken up by the smaller organisms, which are then eaten by the larger organisms. So it goes back to the big fish eating the little fish, and the even bigger fish eating those fish. Yeah. And each time you step up that food chain, you're amplifying the number of contaminants, because by eating a contaminated diet, then you're taking on board those pollutants. Yeah. If you're unlucky enough to sit at the top of the food chain, then you're right at the top there. So you've got all this amplification going on, and you're consuming this load of contaminants. And that's what happens to the poor old polar bear. So the polar bear sits on the ice and will wait to eat the seal, that if he can catch it. And of course, the seals have eaten the fish, and those fish have eaten the smaller fish.
Yeah.
And these chemicals, they love to sit in fat. Many of them do anyway. They're called lipophilic. And in the seal, of course, it has a lot of blubber, which is essentially fatty tissue, so full of these contaminants. So the polar bear will eat the seal, takes on board all these contaminants, and that's his source of contamination. And we know that there are impacts of these chemical contaminants on some reproductive parameters in those species.
Right.
It's the same with the killer whale. The killer whale, top of the food chain there, lots of blubber to keep warm. So the killer whale will eat the whatever killer whales eat, the fish, the seals, whatever, all loaded with contaminants. And the main contaminant problem in killer whales are the PCBs that I mentioned earlier. So they're constantly being exposed and storing these PCBs in their blubber. Now, the complications then arise when they produce the young.
Yeah.
And then produce milk, because in producing milk, the fat tissue is broken down and it releases all these chemical contaminants into the milk, at least the first milk, and hence the calf will consume that milk. And if you like, the calf then takes on board the mother's legacy of exposure to these contaminants over her lifetime.
Wow.
And we know that many of the pods of killer whales have either stopped breeding or breeding rates are very low, and there's a concern on the future of those species at the moment.
Is that something that's comparable to humans? As, again, this legacy effect. So obviously the quality of sperm, or indeed from the female sort of gestation period as well. Any of the effects of fetal development, does that pass on to the child as well?
That's not been conclusively demonstrated in the human. We know more about the other species. Yeah. But I would say that it's certainly a factor that needs to be explored a little bit more. It makes sense, doesn't it? If those chemicals are stored in fats, then when humans lactate, then there could be release of those chemicals into the milk. We do know, actually, if you look at very remote populations, populations of Inuits, for example, that will eat the same as the polar bear, the marine species that are already contaminated with these PCBs and other factors, then we know that in human breast milk there are elevated concentrations in those populations.
Wow.
There are some studies showing that. So it is an area of concern for sure. Definitely.
I think we mentioned earlier this Toxic Town. So Toxic Town is, people may have seen it, our listeners may have seen it, this docuseries that's dramatised on Netflix at the moment that talks about how environmental contaminants affect the development of fetuses in the womb. And that was kind of a big case study that I didn't know about up until this Netflix documentary. But it is so impactful, and it obviously highlights this element of, humans are having an effect on the environment, and this actually is impacting us as a species, which we should really shine a light on. In terms of, obviously we've talked about reproductive health and the effect of the environmental pollutant on that. Are there any other areas of sort of our health in general that these environmental pollutants are having an effect?
I think the expression that you used at the start of this interview, Amy, was the reproductive lens that I look through, and that's right. I do look through a reproductive lens, hence the nature of my studies. But the problem is bigger than just reproduction, because these contaminants can have other sorts of impacts on biological processes. Many of these chemicals are called endocrine disrupting chemicals because they either block the action of hormones or accentuate the action of hormones inappropriately. But metabolism is another area that's impacted. And it really depends on the interests of the I'm saying that in terms of the terminology that's used. If you work on metabolism and you show that there's a disruption of metabolism, then you can use the term metabolism disrupting chemicals as opposed to endocrine disrupting chemicals.
Right.
And there is evidence that these chemicals have effects. So there's potential interaction with diabetes, for example. We're experiencing an obesity epidemic at the moment, and some of these chemicals are obesogens, so that they can actually induce the onset of additional fat tissue as well.
Gosh, it's like a positive feedback loop. If you've got more fat tissue, they're holding more of these chemicals. It's kind of this exponential increase, I guess, of the effect of these contaminants.
Absolutely.
Wow.
So the field is monumental. It really is huge, and there are many groups looking at trends in the onset of insulin-dependent diabetes, for example, and one of the factors being a changing environment and inducing that. There's a cluster of metabolic problems called metabolic syndrome, which you'll see in many of the papers. And that syndrome comprises a number of metabolic disorders, from liver disease all the way through to diabetes. And there are linkages with exposures of these chemicals. And even beyond that, some recent studies indicate that there may be effects on the central nervous system.
Wow.
Autism, for example. I'm not saying, I don't want this to be misinterpreted, that it's the only cause, but it's one of the causes, and something that we need to be aware of.
Wow. So what are the efforts that are being done to help mitigate the risks of the environmental pollutome? What can be done?
Let me start off by saying what can't be done. And what can't be done is that we can't remove the chemicals from the environment. Some of the contaminants are short-lived, but others are very long-lived, and it's hard to remove them. So one of the things that we can do is to increase awareness that these contaminants are out there, and also increase awareness of where they come from.
Yep.
So the use of plastics, for example, is an obvious one to start with. There are so many plastics that we use. I myself will make the journey to the recycling bin or whatever with piles of plastics, and you think, God, can I reduce the use of these if at all possible?
Yeah. It's not just your plastic water bottle that you're drinking off that's leaching into your water. It's the wrapping of your fruit. Potatoes.
Potatoes, as we mentioned earlier. Yes, that's right. Yeah. So if we could get that message over, I think that would help. Also, there's a message to industry, of course. So we hear about replacement chemicals coming into the system, where one chemical has been identified as having these deleterious effects or toxic effects. And so an alternative chemical is used in the process. Quite often that alternative chemical will be equally as deleterious as the one that's been removed.
Yeah.
But at least there's an attempt to replace it.
Yeah.
And then that raises questions on how the toxicity of chemicals is measured. And you can assign a level of toxicity based on the range of tests that you carry out within a laboratory. And if you don't do a specific test that looks at one parameter, then you're not going to know if it affects that.
Yeah.
I would think there are improvements that can be made in assessing those effects and determining whether a chemical is toxic or not.
Yeah.
For example, the longer term effects, maybe a chemical affects the functionality of the gonad. So I've discussed a lot about the testes. We've touched on the ovaries as well. Can talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, definitely.
If you don't look at the offspring, say from an exposed mother, whatever species it is, and take that through, then you're not really going to have the full answer, I should say, as to the impact of these chemicals, because it can be subtle. And then on top of that, we have the added complexity that it's not really looking at a single chemical. It's the mixture effects. We are exposed to a cocktail of contaminants. And I personally feel we need more work on mixture effects of contaminants.
Yeah. Just going back to what you said about the development after birth as well. So I think previously we spoke about how when, for example, when a drug is going through testing, quite often it will be tested on, if it's tested on pregnant mice, the success rate will be, has this mouse carried its offspring to term? Mm-hmm. Yes, it has. Great, it's safe. But actually what needs to be done is looking at that offspring, how it's developed, whether the chemicals that the mother has been exposed to has actually affected the gonads of that offspring as well.
Yes.
Is there anything that's being done to other than kind of what you're saying? Obviously, we're at the start of the journey. I feel like we're at the start of this journey of building this awareness, or sort of semi in the start of the journey of building awareness of this problem. But what do you foresee it's actually going to look like in terms of policy, in terms of testing? Are labs going to do any more testing of like looking at the gonads or not? You know, how big is the problem? Who do we need to talk to about it to get this tested?
It's a great question, and it's a huge challenge to everybody in the field. There is data emerging now of multi-generational effects of these contaminants, and multi and transgenerational effects, which means over 2, 3 or more generations. And I'm really referring to this evolving speciality of epigenetics. There is data out there already that epigenetics plays a role in some of the problems that we link to exposures. So in other words, a pregnant, let's not be species specific here, just a pregnant mammal exposed to contaminants, we know that her offspring may be affected, and then the offspring of those offspring, there could be also problems with the reproductive functionality and even metabolism, and then the offspring of those offspring as well. And so it can cross all of these generations. This is an evolving field, and it's a complex field, but concern is constantly raising in that area. Now, how do you get industry to test that? That's very, very challenging, at least within the first generation, I would say. Yeah. Perhaps there's more that can be done by looking at the offspring and their ability to reproduce. Just going back to my reproductive lens for a moment, that may be a start. Getting further data out there, getting it published, getting the funds in the first place in order to do that work. One of the challenges actually in the field that I'm involved in is getting research funds.
Right.
Because when you look at reproduction and you compare it to cancer, whatever cancer it is, there's more funding in the cancer area than there is in reproduction. I think that reflects a misunderstanding of the importance of reproduction. So right at the start of this interview, I was talking about the increased incidence of testicular cancer in younger men.
Yeah.
And that could have an environmental etiology, and it's actually potentially programmed in the uterus while the male baby is still growing.
Wow.
So that's one cancer which is frequently cited in the literature. But of course, exposure to contaminants is linked with breast cancer in the female as well, and other cancers. There was a study published in the dog, actually, not my work, a colleague of mine in the States, just in the last 2 weeks. And in this particular study, the group looked at bladder cancer in dogs. and they used special silicone rings which they attach to pet dogs, which absorbs contaminants. And they looked at the chemical load in those that they could measure in these silicone rings and related it to the incidence of bladder cancer.
Right.
And there was a direct correlation. So again, it's going back to that sentinel species.
Yeah.
And if we could get more interest from some of the funders in the UK on the huge impact that environmental change is making on reproductive function and the development of cancers, so it's still in there.
Yeah.
Then I think that would.
I think it also probably goes back to, again, like you said, the awareness of reproductive biology. Typically, and I think maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, typically reproductive biology has been seen as a female issue.
Yeah.
So I think I've said this to you previously today. I'm turning 29 tomorrow, right? I've got this pressure of this big 30, this number 30, that I should really be starting to think about having children right now. I've got friends who are pregnant, and that's great. And, you know, there's this fear, oh, if you get to 35, then you're a geriatric mother. You should be thinking about this biological clock. And there's an onus that's put on the female, especially, well, in the human species anyway. But obviously, from the work that you've been doing for the last 25 years and the work of your colleagues and etc., the reproductive health kind of pressure should also be halved with or shared with the male species as well, because obviously the impact in your case of the environment on sperm quality also has an impact on the full term and also offspring development of the child. So this pressure to kind of think about from the male perspective, actually it's your job as well to make sure that you're kind of healthy and have an awareness of this and have impact on the success rate of your offspring. So I think building that awareness as well potentially might help shed that light on the funding needs, really, to help the research that you're doing. Yeah,
I completely agree. It's a complex picture, the one that has a number of different facets to it. If you look at general fertility rates across nations of the world, fertility is declining. And it's measured by the average number of children per woman in a population. It's called the replacement rate, and 2.1 is the number that's always cited. And you can get all this data from the internet very easily, from the World Bank data. And if you start looking at the reasons for that, certainly in the developed world, there is a tendency now to start families later in life, to enable both parents to progress in their careers, which is understandable. But of course, the later you leave it, you have this biological clock that you referred to.
Yeah.
And that is certainly one of the factors that may be impacting on fertility. Then there's the hectic, stressful lives that many of us lead on top of that. And connected with those hectic, stressful lives, there'll be drinking alcohol, smoking. I'm not saying necessarily excessively, but the things that we do as a human population. And then on top of that, those of us who have problems conceiving, couples that have problems conceiving, will get some support. And in a sense, you're establishing pregnancies from couples that wouldn't otherwise have a pregnancy.
Right.
So you're selecting almost for lower fertility. I'm not advocating it shouldn't take place. Don't get me wrong on this.
Yeah.
But if you put all these factors together, then they all play a role. But then we have the environmental effects. Now, you can alter lifestyle. We can do lots of things in lifestyle. You mentioned the Celebrity Save Our Sperm program that I was on, and there was a short experiment within that where 3 celebrities changed lifestyle And that involved exposure to heat, sitting in hot tubs, for example, and warming up testicles is not particularly good if you do a lot of it. Smoking, drinking, excess sugar, all those things. We can try and reduce stress and start having families a little earlier to ensure that there's success. But even if you take out all of those factors, so these are the things we can change, there's still an issue. And what's left behind is the problem of an infertile population.
Yeah.
So no matter how healthy people live, they may be able to establish a pregnancy because those things are changed, and that's fantastic. And that's often the case. But there'll be those where it's still difficult. And that's the population that I'm interested in. I'm interested in all the other effects as well, of course, because it's a bigger picture than just that. So if you take that population, the couples that are really struggling to establish a pregnancy, and you look at the causes just in general terms. So the World Health Organization will say that in 30% of circumstances, the biological problem will lie with the woman. In 30%, the biological problem will lie with the man. And in another 30%, it's a bit of both. And that leaves 10% where we're not sure what the cause is.
Right.
So
but
really
it's split down the middle,
pretty much
male, female.
Split down the middle, yeah.
It's a really
absolutely.
Interesting kind of narrative change to what kind of society views, I guess. Obviously, you mentioned earlier about your the talk you did with the Miscarriage Association, and you said that 90% of that audience was female. This was 10, 20 years ago, potentially. How long ago was that?
1990s.
1990s, 30 years ago.
Yeah, I've been around a while.
Do you see that changing in the work that you're doing? Can you see more male representation in your field? Do you think that the narrative has changed? Do you think there's, obviously you mentioned about awareness needs to be had a bit more to let people, educate people on the effects on sperm, and giving that power, I guess, to the male side of the species to kind of take ownership, and that they need to consider themselves as half of the factor in pregnancies. In terms of the awareness, let's maybe go back to the Celebrity Save Our Sperm. This is on top of all the amazing research that you've done for your career. You're a massive advocate of public outreach and engagement. And you were involved in this documentary with Ollie Locke, Melvin Hume, and Russell Kane. Maybe you could describe what that was. What was the premise of the show, and how do you foresee it impacting the world, I guess? Okay.
So there's lots of questions all bundled up into a sort of overall premise there, isn't there? So, if I start with the program, I think many people who watch this podcast may have seen the Celebrity Save Our Sperm. So these were 3 celebrities that had their own reproductive challenges on the male side. And so the premise of the show was to take these 3 celebrities and to look at their lifestyle and to change elements of their lifestyle over a period of 12 weeks. Because it takes about 12 weeks to make sperm from the most immature cell in the testis.
Okay.
And then to see if that made a difference. So one of the celebrities, as I mentioned earlier, Ollie Locke, he smoked, he enjoyed his hot tub. I don't blame him for that, but it's the frequency, isn't it? And so there are elements of his lifestyle that could be changed. Melvin had a passion for sugary sweets, and if you watch the program, he opens a cupboard and it's full of sweets, and that's his. There's an expression, I can't remember what it is.
Vice.
Yes, that is vice. Yes, absolutely. He's a pretty fit guy because he goes to the gym quite a lot, and interestingly, in the gym he would wear several layers of clothing. So he's got more than one layer over his testes. So when he's working out, his testes were getting really warm, and heat is not good for sperm production.
Yeah.
the whole reason us guys have testicles in a scrotum is to keep them cooler than the rest of the body, because they just don't function if they get up to body temperature. And then Russell Kane, he a very good comedian, as I'm sure you know. He performs on stage with the tight leather trousers, and he walks up and down. He's a very active guy, performs brilliantly, and he's in the spotlights and gets very hot. So that would have introduced an element of heat exposure. And he also used a product in his hair. I've forgotten the name of it now off the top of my head, but it's a product that will contain contaminants. So he put a lot of that on his hair.
Hair growth
serums, thing, yes. Yeah. Plus he drank, was it 12 or 14 espressos per day? I think it was.
Something like that, yeah.
So there are clear things that are relatively straightforward to alter.
Yeah.
And so the three of them produced a sperm sample, and the sperm was analysed by my colleague, Dr. Jonathan Ramsey, who's based in London. And he gave the feedback to the three in terms of their levels and whether it was normal or abnormal. Then they underwent this period of reformed life, if you like, and then they had another sample taken 12 weeks later, and there was a clear improvement. So it was a clear demonstration in all three cases, actually, that changing lifestyle can impact on fertility.
Yeah.
I was involved in the program because I was asked to speak about environmental effects. So I showed some sperm. It was sperm collected from a dog, actually, but it's very, very similar to the human. And we exposed sperm to a contaminant and showed what effects that contaminant could have.
Have you seen any impact off the back of that program coming out about awareness, about potential funding, anything like that? Or do you think there's a lot more things to do?
I think there's a lot more things to do. A lot of people have said to me, I saw you on that program, and people watch it just out of curiosity, which is great. And the more people that watch it, the better. There's an extended version of that program, incidentally, through the website of the Society for Reproduction and Fertility, where I further question, along with Anand Patel, who was involved in the program, and we meet up again with Ollie Locke and Melvin O'Hume to talk about their challenges again. So that's also worth a watch. There's a lot more that we can do. I hope when this Netflix documentary comes out, many people around the world have contributed to this Netflix documentary, and it's purely from a scientific perspective, looking at the evidence for declining fertility, particularly in the male, but also a bit in the female as well. Putting it all together. The documentary is called Infertile, and we're hoping that this will be out later this year. So I think
really excited about that.
I'm very excited about that.
You mentioned about the female aspect there as well. I just wanted to go back to you. Obviously, we've talked about how the environmental pollutome can have a big impact on sperm quality and testes development, etc. We mentioned also about the ovaries. Maybe you could touch on how it affects the female as well.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So another research area that I've been involved with is actually working with sheep. So this is a big shift from the work I've described already. And the idea of the sheep is that a standard or common, I should say, agricultural practice for farmers is to use the one of the cheaper fertilizers for helping the grass grow. And the fertilizer that they use, it's called biosolids. And biosolids is generated from a human sewage and processed sewage, so processed wastewater, sort of effluent from that whole processing process. So our waste is converted into pellets and it's ploughed into the pastures. And it's a sensible thing to do because obviously we produce a lot of sewage and we need to get rid of it. It used to be dumped at sea, which wasn't deemed very healthy. And on the face of it, it seems fine. However, a number of years ago, and it's quite a few years back now, we wondered whether the fact that we were using our own sewage was actually reintroducing the contaminants that we've personally been exposed to back into the environment.
Right.
Okay, so we've already established through this interview that we're exposed all the time to contaminants around, to this cocktail of contaminants. And so to investigate that, there were some screening studies of contaminants in biosolids and biosolid treated pastures. And yes, there were differences. They're definitely there. But we found that when we put pregnant ewes on pastures that had been fertilized with the biosolids, and we compared those pregnant ewes to those put on pastures fertilized with an inorganic fertilizer, so that doesn't have the inherent problem of contaminants coming from us.
Yeah.
There were differences in the way the males developed and the way the females developed. So you asked about the ovaries. So we published a paper on the ovaries in these lambs, in these female lambs. They were late gestation female fetuses, the initial paper anyway. And we showed that there was an imbalance in the way that those eggs in the ovaries were developing.
Wow.
So when the egg develops, as it approaches the time to ovulate, it goes through a number of developmental stages. And that developmental trajectory at the very, very earliest stages have been altered.
Wow.
So there's clearly an impact on the developing female.
And does that translate to humans obviously developing the ovaries? Does it affect the menstrual cycle? Does it affect menopause?
Absolutely. So there is a number of studies looking at the timing of menopause, looking at the timing of puberty as well. And also problems like PCOS, which is polycystic ovarian syndrome.
Yeah.
That's multifactorial, but one of the factors, not the only factor, only one of the factors could be environmental.
And not just environmental at the point that they're born, but also when they're mothers, when they were in utero. Is it predetermined in utero?
Yes, issues? Yeah, absolutely. If you think about it, actually, we're very concerned about the male, and I'm not going to downplay the male side because I think it's critically important, and there is a biological crisis there that we need to address further. But you could counter-argue that us guys can afford to lose some sperm. It only takes one after all, doesn't it? If we can get that one sperm to the egg, that's fine. When you start to lose eggs with the capacity to be fertilized on the female side, that's a different story.
Yeah, they're finite.
They're finite, absolutely. Yeah. So we're all born, the women are born, females are born with a set number of eggs in their ovaries. And some of those eggs will go on to ovulate and potentially be fertilized. If that starting number is reduced right from the outset, then just theoretically, there must be an impact on reproductive potential later in life. And a lot of the papers produced to date support that. And
premise. Menopause as well. Obviously, earlier menopause, if you've got less eggs to start with, you're going to get into menopause that much earlier.
Yes, that's
fascinating that you can take this from sheep.
Yes.
Just take this information from sheep and translate it all the way over to humans as well. So maybe going back to more of your public outreach and how obviously your work is so translational to humans and how we can maybe use your work and create change. We've talked about the Channel 4 documentary and your Netflix documentary. Are there any other kind of organisations that you're working with? You mentioned a society there to kind of help spread the word.
Yeah. So I used to be the chair of the Society for Reproduction and Fertility, the SRF. And the SRF does some fantastic work in providing opportunity for people to do research, which in turn raises awareness of all of these problems. And there's a public engagement element to that. The extended interview situation with the celebrities I mentioned earlier was an SRF initiative, in fact.
Right.
So the societies can do a lot, and it's not just the SRF. There are equivalent societies in the United States and in Australia that we have linkages with. I say we because I used to be the chair. I always think of we, but there's a connection between these three societies, and we have exchange speakers at our respective conferences and that sort of thing. And all those three societies are on the same page, providing opportunity and raising awareness. What we're trying to do now is to extend that international grouping to include other countries, including the less developed countries, which is really, really important. And we're in the process of trying to establish, because we haven't achieved it yet, but it's looking good, to establish a federation of reproductive biology societies. And the vision, we're working on the vision, but certainly the vision will include developing a platform to provide opportunity, to raise awareness of these type of issues. The environmental side will certainly be way up there. To bring in funding agencies at conferences that we run that involve all of these societies in the future. Agencies like the Gates Foundation, for example, we would like to engage with because of the great work that the foundation does. So those are the type of things that I'm involved in and very passionate about it as well.
Definitely. What's the thing that in your lifetime you hope to change with this kind of activity? If
I can get to a point where I feel that people are, first of all, have an increased awareness of environmental impacts on general health and reproductive health, and are starting to ask questions and saying, well, hold on a minute, we've got enough challenges in life. Can't we do something about these pollutants? Can't we live in a healthier world? Then I will be happy, I think. We have a long way to go. And also getting people to talk about their reproductive challenges, because these areas are very much intertwined. Many, many times across my career, I find myself talking to people at a social function, whatever that social function is, and it gets onto the areas I've worked with in fertility. And all of a sudden, I hear lots and lots of stories about fertility challenges. It really is a huge problem that affects so many people.
I mean, I think recently the narrative of miscarriage is becoming more talked about, but I was shocked to hear that 1 in 4 women miscarry.
Yes.
But it's only within probably the last 5-10 years that the conversation has become more mainstream, when celebrities have talked about their experience, etc.
Yes.
But you're right, obviously it's deemed quite a private issue. And because of that, people don't want to talk about it, or don't know how to talk about it, or don't feel like it's appropriate to talk about it. But actually, it's a fundamental thing to talk about to generate life. Realistically, it's a big question to be answered. So I think the work that you're doing is phenomenal. And I hope that in the next 5 years, 10 years, the people will talk about it more and realise that it's a very normal thing to talk about, and hopefully try and tackle some of the issues that you've alluded to.
Well, I think just to put a plug in for Test Him, I think they do tremendous work in raising awareness on male fertility issues. And of course, I did a podcast with Test Him as well. And they get guys talking about male reproductive challenges. The comedian Rod Gilbert was involved in this area before he became unwell himself. Raising awareness of male fertility challenges. And there are other groupings focused on the female side as well that do equally as good a job. I just do my bit, promote what I can, and link in with others that have a similar vision, similar aims. Yeah.
Well, I think you're doing a big bit for the field in general. So just as a final question, you've had such an incredible career for the last 25 years. You've worked on some amazing projects that are so translatable to the human experience. Is there any sort of key highlights or very distinct experiences that stand out for you?
Yes, it brings to mind one journey I went on, or a couple of journeys I went on to further explore the concept that declining male fertility may be a problem of industrialized countries only. So I've mentioned earlier about the polar bears and the killer whales and how these contaminants are transported on air currents and amplified through the food chain. An idea that a colleague of mine had a few years back, not too many years back actually, was that what if we could find a remote human population? Would that human population, the male component of that, have the same fertility challenges that we see in the Western world? Could we look at sperm quality? And we were lucky enough to get some funding to travel to two remote areas of Colombia on separate. Went twice actually. One was up in the mountainous regions towards the south of Colombia, mid to south, not far from Narino, and that was to meet with a community to talk about fertility and to look at sperm. And the other expedition was right in the southernmost region of Colombia, where it borders Brazil and Peru, and this is in the Amazonian rainforest. So Colombia is a very diverse country. So up in the north, it can be quite cold, and in the south, you have the tropics of the Amazonian rainforest. And we took. If I go to the Amazonian one first, we went to this place called Leticia. It's you can look it up on the map. It's southernmost part in Colombia, and through a Colombian colleague of mine, a technician who used to work at the vet school, she had established a link with a local community. A tribal village in the Amazonian rainforest that required traveling to Leticia by plane and then taking a boat up the Amazon and ultimately visiting this community. Now, interestingly, the community was matriarchal. So it was the women that were running, making the decisions for the tribe. And through our interpreter, Mary, her name was, she managed to get the leaders, the female leaders, to agree that their men could donate their sperm to a project, so we could just have a look and see what was in there and if everything was okay. And so we went along to this village, flew to Leticia, took the boat up the Amazon, transported our microscope. We had a battery from which we could run the microscope, which we had the challenge of transporting all the way from the UK, and our equipment and everything. And it was very, very hot, as you can imagine. And we arrived and managed to get our equipment up into the village, and were invited to a tribal meeting. And it's like the local council meeting. Very nice people, I might add, just in a very, very different setting to what we were normally exposed to. And so we sat in the meeting, and the agenda had our visit as the last item on the agenda. And we wondered why that might be. However, we sat there exhausted because we travelled halfway around the planet to get there. And it was very hot as well, and we were still adjusting to the temperature and everything. And when it came to talk about our visit, our interpreter stood up and reminded everyone about the visit. And then a man stood up who was clearly a man of the church, because he had his black robes and a big crucifix around his neck. And he provided a counter-argument to the agreements which had been discussed with the leaders of the tribe. And he had a number of stories about some other communities being visited by scientists and that they'd all gone sterile. And it was that type of making people nervous and fearful of these strangers in their midst. And to cut a long story short, the leaders of the tribe felt compelled to change their mind in terms of the objectives of our visit. And the objectives of our visit were to collect sperm samples from men that agreed, and we would pay them for the sample. And we'd explain to them that we wanted to look at the health of their sperm and to see if the problems that we'd seen in the rest of the world existed in this remote location. So we were really disappointed on that. And my colleague, Professor David Gardner, his name is, had bought a case full of clothes as well for the tribe, but we gave from his own kids that had grown up. So he passed on those clothes and things. And then we went back to the place where we were staying in this village, very basic place. And the next boat back was 6 days later. So we thought, well, we're going to be here for 6 days and we can't do any of the work that we wanted to do. However, we spoke to the owner of the house in which we were staying, the equivalent of a hotel. And he said that he could find an alternative route for us, perhaps to collect some samples. And so he disappeared and went out talking to the community. And one by one, we had these gentlemen arriving at the hotel, and they would be interviewed by Mary, who was Colombian herself, in Spanish. So we agreed on the sheet like a consent form, so they fully understood why we were there. They would disappear with their pot and come back with a sample, and I would sit in a hut, a shed at the back of this building with a microscope powered by this battery, and assess sperm using a computerized system that I had there. And so that was the most exciting visit that I'd been on, really. And we looked at the samples. We're still analysing that data because it's a complex demographic there, and we need to look further at the lifestyle and nutrition, any vices that those gentlemen had. So it's taken a while to get it out there. We have presented it at a fertility meeting and shown some differences in trace element levels. The other visit, incidentally, just in brief, was up in the mountains, and that was a little easier. So we, I think we arrived. Yes, we had some football shirts. The Colombians are really, really keen on football, as I'm sure you know. Even in the Amazonian rainforest, we'd watch the youngsters playing football, and they challenge each other. So one of them would wear just one shoe, and they'd still score the goals. They were very talented. So as soon as you mentioned football and you got some football shirts or football memorabilia, we had them on board and interested in us. And so we collected a similar set of samples from this mountain community.
Amazing.
A little less remote. And that's all part of this set of unique samples that we're still investigating.
Oh, fantastic. I'm really looking forward to seeing that data published. That would be amazing to see. Wow. Well, it goes to show how scientific careers can literally take you to all corners of the world and beyond. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. It's been an amazing conversation. Hopefully our listeners will also have got some insight into how they can kind of navigate their own life to protect their own reproductive health as well. So thank you so much for sharing that information.
It's been a pleasure.
So if you enjoyed this episode today and want to learn more about the big questions of the day that help us to read the book of life, then like and subscribe to our podcast or follow us on our socials. Thank you for listening.